Nothing lasts forever. No matter how new or exciting something appears to be when it's first created, it will eventually reach a stage of obsolescence. When that stage is reached, one of two things will happen. It'll either be destroyed or it will be left behind somewhere as an abandoned curiosity. We love those abandoned curiosities, and we think they're things to be celebrated. Join us for a look at some of the most unique abandoned machinery, equipment, and vehicles the world has ever seen. The idea of a floating restaurant isn't a new one. Waterborne restaurants are considered to be the epitome of class in most parts of the world, and you'll usually find a few in any developed country that has either a coastline or rivers. The overwhelming majority of them don't look as opulent or decadent as this massive floating Chinese restaurant, though. If only its good looks had been enough to save the company who owned and operated it from bankruptcy. We don't know precisely when the end came for this enormous floating eatery, but based on the pictures, we'd have to assume that it arrived suddenly. There are still menus on some of the tables, and glasses are still stacked up behind the bar, ready to serve drinks. Even with the vandalism that's gone on inside the restaurant since it closed its doors, there's enough glamour inside to tell us this must have been a spectacular place to come for a meal. It doesn't look damaged past the point of no return, so perhaps someone will step in to save it one day. We all probably have different ideas about what the cars of the future might look like. The concept of driverless cars is a popular one at the moment, but more optimistic people like to imagine that cars will fly through the air in years to come. Back in the 1990s, a man called John Bender had his own idea about what cars might look like in the future. So he decided to try to build something that resembled his vision. It took him 3 years, but here's his creation. It's called the Bendera Ford, and at one point in the past, it was registered to be driven legally on the streets of Ohio in the United States of America. Opinions are divided over whether the fiberglass creation looks like a spaceship or a space-age piece of junk, but Bender was very proud of it when he finished his work. He even built 2 more identical cars and tried to persuade Ford to take them on as a model and mass-produce them. But they passed on the idea. As time went on, Bender's enthusiasm for the project must have failed because his prototype eventually became abandoned to rust and decay. What a shame. No car manufacturer or engineer wants their creation to be branded the ugliest car in history. But someone has to hold that dubious honor. And for many people, it's the 1957 Aurora. Built and launched in New York, it attracted brutal press reviews because of its unusual appearance. But good looks weren't supposed to be the point of the car. It was intended to mark a new age of vehicular safety. It also had an unusual designer in the shape of Catholic priest Father Alfred Giuliano, who wanted to make America's roads safer for families. The reviews doomed the project, and the priest and his company went bankrupt after building just one prototype model. At the heart of the Aurora is a 1953 Buick with a plywood superstructure built around it and a coating of fiberglass. From a safety point of view, it came with a roll cage, padded instruments, side impact bars, and a collapsible steering wheel. All of those features were pioneering ideas for the 1950s. After the public rejected the idea, Father Giuliano kept the Aurora for personal use until 1967, when he sold it for a low price to an auto shop. British car enthusiast Andy Sanders purchased the decrepit wreck of a vehicle in 1993 and spent 12 years refurbishing and repairing it, so today it looks as good as new. Soviet communication ship SSV-33 Ural is a first-class example of a good idea poorly executed. With her high-tech radio electronic equipment and her enormous size, she should have marked a whole new era for the Navy of the Soviet Union when she launched in May 1983. Instead, she became something of an expensive embarrassment. The 900-foot-long vessel, modeled loosely after the Kirov-class battlecruiser, was supposed to be capable of tracking missiles, space tracking, and performing electronic surveillance. She might have proven to be able to do all of those things if she'd ever made it out to sea. But she didn't. The Soviet Union's Navy didn't have any piers large enough to accommodate the Ural, and so whenever she moved, she was forced to anchor out. That necessitated keeping several of her onboard systems running and pushed up her operating costs enormously. Eventually, she was repurposed as a floating barracks, and the unused radioelectric equipment aboard started to deteriorate and fail through lack of maintenance. She was formally decommissioned in 2002, less than 20 years after she was launched, and consigned to be scrapped in 2018. The American government remains tight-lipped about what the purpose of the short stretch of railway known as Track 61 used to be. It hides in plain sight below the Waldorf Hotel in New York, and legend has it was an emergency escape route for U.S. presidents and other high-ranking officials to get out of New York in a hurry in the event the city was attacked by a foreign power. The whole underground facility was created at the same time as Grand Central Terminal itself, but its existence was kept quiet for decades. Once upon a time, there was an old train hiding in the darkness of Track 61, known as the FDR train, named after former President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's been rumored, but never confirmed, that the track and train were used to bring the president into New York in secret, thus enabling officials to hide the fact that he was paralyzed from the public. The government has never confirmed that story, but then they've never confirmed anything about Track 61 at all. The rusty, seemingly disused site is still accessible from an unmarked door close to the hotel at street level, but the door is kept locked at all times. If you've ever wondered where enormous pieces of agricultural and mining machinery go when they're no longer needed, the answer is to Germany. There you'll find a large outdoor site in Grafenhainichen known as Feropolis, which has become quite a rusty spectacle and a somewhat unlikely tourist destination. Envisioned by its creators as a city of iron, the skyline at Feropolis is dominated by the presence of 5 gigantic, retired extractors, with their ripping blades still attached. Many years ago, the land that Feropolis stands upon was a coal mine, and some of the machinery you'll find there is a relic of that era. Its new identity and purpose began in 1995, when the machinery started to be used as the backdrop for concerts and music festivals. The most famous individual piece of machinery here is the 427-foot-long, 98-foot-tall crawler swing excavator known as the Racehorse, which visitors are welcome to climb up and enjoy the view from the top, so long as they're willing to pay a few for doing so. In 1955, the construction company La Torno won a contract for a job with a very specific brief: to create an off-road vehicle capable of crossing the icy, treacherous terrain of Alaska. That would be a challenging assignment in any circumstances, but this wasn't to be any old all-terrain vehicle. It had to be large enough to haul cargo on the kind of scale that would usually be performed by a train. That's why the resulting prototype vehicle, officially known as the LCC-1, was nicknamed the Land Train. To travel over tundra without getting stuck, it needed a set of enormous 10-foot-tall wheels, driven by a diesel-powered generator. At the end, it featured a full-size powered crane. After an extensive period of testing, it was eventually shipped to Greenland, where it underwent further testing in Arctic conditions and was rechristened the Snow Train. Even though it was perfectly suited to the task it was designed for, the idea never caught on, and the Snow Train eventually became abandoned in Alaska outside a disused scrapyard in Fort Wainwright, where pieces of it remain to this day. Although most people's definition of a limousine is a long, black, sleek-looking car with tinted windows, you can make a limousine out of almost any road car if you customize it and extend it enough. As evidence of that fact, here's a Fox Mustang limousine from the 1980s. These days, it's rotting away in a field, and it appears to have been stripped of almost all the parts that would allow anybody to drive it. But in its heyday, it was a movie star. It made its big screen debut in a film called The Jerky Boys back in 1995, over a decade after it was created. but back then it was still in good condition. Perhaps its abandonment is connected to the fate of the film. It's widely considered to be one of the worst movies ever made and currently holds a rating of a miserable 9% on the Rotten Tomatoes website. We can't help but wonder if it was briefly owned by a rock star. A glimpse through the windows at the car's headrest reveals that the logo of the band Deftones is emblazoned there in the position the Mustang logo would typically be. If that were ever the case, its rock and roll days are behind it now. All-terrain vehicles come in a range of different shapes and sizes, but we can't recall ever seeing one that looks like this Russian vehicle before. It was built by Moskvich, and at the time the manufacturer created it, it was seen as a potential new line of income for the company after they lost out on a lucrative military contract because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The idea was a simple one. They would take the body of one of their standard automobile units, mount it on tracks, and turn it into a machine capable of crossing any type of terrain. It might not be the prettiest car you've ever seen, but at only 485 pounds, it certainly is at the lighter end of the all-terrain vehicle scale. Inside the vehicle, the engine and transmission were the same as you'd find on a Moskvich 412, but the steering wheel was taken out and replaced with tractor levers. It might have worked for its intended purpose, but a combination of its ugliness and its lack of driver comforts meant Moskvich couldn't find a market for it. They built 3 prototypes, of which this is the only one that still exists. As you can see, it's in poor condition today. Visit the small town of Pueblo in Colorado, USA, and you might come across a piece of vehicular history parked up on the side of an otherwise unremarkable road. You'd never be able to guess its purpose just by looking at it, but this is actually the carcass of the Grumman Track Levitated Research Vehicle. Many years ago, it was thought that vehicles like this would be the future of transport on rails. The Grumman was designed to hover above the track on a cushion of air. And thanks to the lack of friction between the train and the track, it was hoped that it would speed across the USA at speeds of up to 300 miles per hour. It failed because somehow the people involved in the planning and testing of the Grumman neglected to build a track long enough for it to reach its maximum acceleration. Frustrated by the lack of progress and the inability of the aero train to reach its maximum speed, the Urban Mass Transportation Administration pulled funding from the Grumman project during the 1970s and condemned it to its current situation. It's supposed to become part of a new section of the Pueblo Railway Museum dedicated to hovercraft, but there's no sign of such a facility being built. Speaking of hovercraft, here's another take on the idea of using hovercraft as public transport from even longer ago. It's the Curtiss Wright hovercraft, designed and tested in 1958. It might look like the kind of carriage you'd see on the track of a roller coaster these days, but in the late 1950s, this was cutting-edge, futuristic design at its finest. The Curtiss Wright Corporation was primarily known for building planes and other types of aircraft, so when it briefly appeared that hovercraft would become the future of transport in the USA, the company tried to get ahead of the curve with this invention. Unfortunately for them, the curve never arrived, and their creation was never picked up for mass production, even though they demonstrated that it worked with a maximum speed of 35 miles per hour over land or water. As a last roll of the dice, they tried to get the U.S. military interested in adapting their hovercraft for Army purposes, but the military declined, and the prototype was abandoned. A few years ago, it briefly made the news when it turned up for sale on eBay with a reserve price of $100,000. The Soviet military was known around the world for building large and sometimes unusual machines, and Submarine B307 certainly meets that description. When it was finished in 1980, it was the biggest diesel submarine in the world. It's still an impressive sight today, but you don't have to look below the waves to find it. It's standing on grassland in Tolyatti in Russia, where it's been for more than a decade. In a military career that lasted just over 20 years and ended in 2001, B307 was mostly deployed between the Barents and the Mediterranean, but managed to avoid becoming involved in any military conflict in her entire career. After she was formally decommissioned, she was sold to a company that operated a private museum and was supposed to become a part of a new museum complex, but the difficulties involved in transporting the colossal vehicle forced a change of plans. It was eventually decided to turn the submarine itself into a museum, and it opened its doors to visitors for the first time in 2016 after 15 years of standing lifeless. We suppose that means this story has a happy ending. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.